Listen closely. Let the sound of my voice be the slow, steady thing you hold on to as the rest of the galaxy unfurls around you. Distant, immense, and very, very quiet. Imagine, if you will, a vessel drifting on a black sea the color of old lacquer. It moves without haste, an obedient animal kept between two currents, its hull scabbed with 1,000 tiny scars like a veteran's weathered hand. Inside, the lights glow like watchful eyes. The air tastes of cold metal and resin, and the faint, sweet smoke of incense that has burned too long. There is a hush here that feels like a blessing. No shout of battle, no frantic running of feet. For now, there is only the slow, mechanical breathing of the ship. The Imperialis cogitator that governs the ship's slow song hums in low tones, voices of gears translated into the liturgy of the machine. Close your eyes and imagine that sound, a deep, rhythmic thrum, like distant waves folding over stone. It is comforting. It is old. It has been the same for longer than any single life aboard this hull. The crew call it the lullaby of the engines. The tech priests call it the omniscia's murmur. The soldiers sleep through it, or pretend to, wrapped in their blankets with weapons by their shoulders like sleeping dogs. Even the voxes, when they crackle and sigh, do so in the soft static of someone breathing in sleep. There are 6 among our small detachment I want you to know, not because you must remember names like a ledger, but because they will be the shapes in the dim light as the story draws its first lines. There is Dominus Varrock, whose fingers are more metal than flesh, and who walks with a measured tilt, as if the world itself were a component to be balanced. Varrock's voice is a gravelly hymn to the machine god. He speaks slowly, with the patient cadence of cogitators rebooting. There is Vigilator Crew, a sergeant whose hands still remember the warmth of a wife's palm, though he will not say her name aloud. Crew's face is a map of small regrets, a scar through the jaw, a white line across an eyebrow where a shrapnel found purchase once. He keeps a rosary of tiny servo skulls tucked beneath his breastplate. The skulls blink occasionally with a compassionate, mechanical luminescence. There is Mara Leston, a medic whose eyes are 2 quiet pools of compassion. Mara hums when she works, a simple tune that fits the rhythm of breaths, and she tends to wounds the way one might tend to a very old, very dear book. Around them move the engine-washed ghosts of other souls. A handful of guardsmen, voices hushed, careful with laughter lest it disturb the proper order of things. An augur priest who keeps watch on the auspex, fingers drifting across glass like a priest tracing scripture. And a handful of civilians evacuated from worlds that had suffered sudden hunger, families with tired children clutching small, battered comforts. They do not speak loudly here. In the lulling glow of lumen globes and emergency nacelles, their voices fold into the ambient song of the ship. Listen to the way the corridor breathes. The footfalls are softened by worn plating and braided fibers. The lights flicker in time with the engines, and every flicker is a punctuation mark in a very long sentence. There are banners hung in small alcoves, insignia and sigils that catch dust like petals. There are reliquaries, 2 cases of relics collected from 100 worlds, polished by hands and protected by prayers. A servo-arm occasionally passes, a small, obedient thing, polishing a cog with the tender care of a monk stroking rosary beads. Everything moves as if in a slow procession towards some unseen altar. We begin with very ordinary things. Prelude comforts, the smell of burnt oil and the softness of a blanket, the low murmur of prayer. Time here flows like honey. It thickens around the edges and lets the mind sink into its sweetness. This is important. To start with softness is to make the harder things taste even stranger when they arrive. Let yourself sink, breathe evenly, feel the slow pulse of the ship beneath your palms, and understand the patience of the scene. There is a calm in this place the way there is a calm on a winter morning before the frost cracks. Yet even in the cradle of warmth there are threads of unease. The first is almost laughably small, a static note in the Vox channels, like a cough in the throat of the vastness outside. It is easy to dismiss, a faulty relay, a solar flare. But the augur priest's fingers twitch and the servoskulls blink with unexpected synchronization. That small, errant sound is the first breadcrumb. It settles in the ears and makes the teeth chatter in a way that has nothing to do with cold. Dominus Veruk traces his palm along the nearest maintenance port, as if to read the pulse of a sleeping animal. He murmurs to himself in the old gear-laden tongue, a prayer that might be to the machine, or to the man who founded the machine's code. The other tech priests respond in devout micropauses, a static harmony of ritual and logic. You can sense that for them, the ship is not merely a home. It is a body suffused with holiness. They have traded their softness for certainty, their sinew for gears. Their rituals are precise, and their affection for the cold metal is a delicate thing that borders on love. But there are moments, small tremors under the plating, when even Veruk's steady hands rest without pressure and the augur priest's eyes drift, not to the code, but outward, to the void. Outside the ship, the stars are patient and innumerable, like teeth in a mouth that stretches forever. They keep their distance. The crew speak of them in the whisper of old men telling tales of ocean horizons. When the ship's auspex sweeps its quiet beams across the dark, numbers and graphs bloom into existence on the holoscreens, coordinates, gravimetric readings, and the tiny signatures of worlds like beads on a rosary. On one such sweep, the sensors pause and do something they rarely do. They hesitate. A minor hiccup, a reading with an odd cadence, a biosignature that seems not to belong. It is the kind of thing that would be written off by a casual observer as a sensor anomaly. But the augur priest's head tilts the way sunflowers tilt, and he whispers one name only, not quite loud enough for the others. Hunger. His voice is a bruise against the calm. The word slides into the corridors like a faint chill. It is not a name in the sense of a designation. It is a description, a quality that can be smelled in the air if one were sensitive enough. You may ask how a thing like hunger might exist in the vacuum between suns. Hunger, as these men know it, is ancient. It is the first law of life. It crawls through the bones of the galaxy in slow, patient currents. The augur priest does not speak of monsters. He speaks of appetite, of a force that does not reason but consumes. Veruk draws his fingers across a schematic, and the red lines show where the ship's defenses would react. Flares, pulse blasts, hull seals. The diagrams promise many answers, but behind his measured motions there is a tremor. He is a man who trades in certainties, and there are moments when the certainty feels as fragile as spun glass. There are small joys that persist nonetheless. Mara tends to the wounded with the care of someone who stitches together childhoods. She tends to the coffee pots for the watchmen and hums when bandaging elbows and mending torn clothing. The guardsmen swap stories of planets where the sun felt warmer and the nights were less sharp. They describe, in a few low tones, the memory of wind and the taste of real fruit, common things that sound like forbidden luxuries aboard a vessel that runs on conserved atmospheres and rationed light. Crew keeps a feather in his locker plucked from some long-dead bird, and when no one watches he will run it between his fingers and remember, for a breath, what it felt like to be unarmored. The ship moves on. Days, if they can be called that in a craft without a sky, are measured by routine. The sweep of the maintenance bots, the slow recalibration of sensors, the community of quiet prayer. Yet even routine has its small ruptures. A maintenance drone brings back something that was not on the manifest. A fragment of organic material, dark and fibrous, with a texture like dried seaweed. It smells faintly of iron and something more foreign, a sweet rot that is not exactly rot. Veruk examines the sample with a clinical interest, fingers cold with metal, and the augur priest's face, usually set like a carved relief, has the softness of a suddenly closed eyelid. "You see," whispers one of the soldiers. His voice is barely a rasp. Voices in the dark are conspirators of the mind. The augur priest does not answer with words. Instead, he places a small sigil upon the sample with a tremulous hand and then, with a ritual inveterate as prayer, sets the little piece within a reliquary lock. The The seal clicks, a tiny sound like a coin dropped in a cup. The action is meant to reassure, to make the unknown small and manageable. It does, for a little while. There are other things to occupy the mind. The children play a game called Names, whispering to one another, and inventing lives for the icons stitched inside their worn toys. They ask the soldiers about Earth and distant oceans, and whether the stars taste like sugar. The soldiers answer, softening in a way that time does to stone. They tell tales of suns and deserts and forests that are thicker than any woven tapestry. The adults smile and let the veneer of hope persist. Hope is a fragile creature here, and it is tended like a garden, watered, pruned, protected from the frost of reality. And yet, beneath all of it, the ship keeps a secret rhythm. It is in the way the servoskulls pause for fractions of a second over a particular corridor. The way a maintenance hatch inexplicably shows signs that someone, or something, had been inside and moved a tool to a different angle. There are nights when the lumen globes sputter and the emergency lights bring the corridors into a washed, ghostly relief. In those moments, shadows feel not like the absence of light, but like presence. They are soft but purposeful, like breath on the nape of the neck. Toward the end of our chapter, the Auspex picks up a vague pattern over a nearby world. It is not sharp, nor is it clear. It is more of a suggestion, a shifting bloom of readings that could be weather, could be mineral deposits, could be the subtle respiration of organisms too vast to catalog in one sweep. The augur priest traces the pattern with his fingertips, and his pupils narrow to slits. He does not say Tyranid, because names are sharp things that cut. He says instead that there is a presence. Presence weighs differently than absence. Presence carries with it the sense of intent. Dominus Verux sits in a small alcove and allows the murmur of the engines to play through him, aligning his internal rhythms with the mechanical heartbeat of the ship. He does what all men must do in the face of small alarms. He prepares. The servo arms course through their maintenance protocols. Cannons are cycled in ritual practice, and the guardsmen stand with weapons brushed and bayonets oiled. They move through these motions with the comfort of muscle memory. Preparation is a kind of prayer when words will not do. We end this opening passage as the vessel alters course very slightly. The change is almost imperceptible. A gentle angle coaxing the ship toward the dim halo on the holoscreen where the Auspex suggests a strange beauty and an older appetite. Outside, the cold stars blink with indifference. Inside, the engines sing what might be a lullaby for the watchers and a requiem for the things yet to awake. Hold that image. The slow tilt, the soft lights, and the small, sudden hush that comes just before the universe makes a new sound. Sleep now if you will, trusting the rhythm that cradles you. Know the names of the people who stand watch. The tech priest who loves his gears, the guard who misses his home, the medic who hums as she heals. Remember the soft sounds, the hum of engines, the whisper of prayers, the muted clink of tools. But let that memory keep a small room for something else, a sensation like someone listening at the door. It is a patient thing. It knows the sound of breathing, the taste of metal on a tongue, the weight of a sleeping world. It will wait. There is a way to speak of a thing that strips it bare and leaves only its appetite. There is another way to speak of a thing so you might understand its weight inside a man's ribcage, how it moves with the pulse and the slow syllables of memory. In this chapter, we let both ways breathe. We will study the machinery, the rites, the clinical lists of augmentations, and we will lean into the small, private moments where a hand remembers a child's laugh and an eye remembers the curve of a summer sky. Between those two lenses, mechanical and humane, we will meet the true, terrible nature of what haunts the vessel and the minds aboard it. First, the priests. Dominus Verux and his kind are not monsters. They are worshippers who have accepted that the altar must be their own body. Imagine a man sitting at a lathe, turning his flesh as if it were craftwood. At first, the changes are subtle. A piece of bone carved down, a tendon replaced with a braided cable, a larynx fitted with a valve that hums a pitch tuned to the ship's engines. It begins with a promise, to be more precise, to be less fallible, and it ends in a geometry of steel and ritual that reads like scripture. The liturgy of the tech priest is a lattice of repeated motions. The polishing of a cog, the whispering of maintenance hymns, the blessing of warm oil over servos with fingertips that have become more sensor than skin. Varroc's right hand is a masterpiece of engineering and faith. It is segmented into fine joints and houses a dozen delicate tools that can, without fuss, strip the corrosion from an ancient manifold or cradle a dying man's breath with surgical tenderness. When he moves that hand, the fingers click and the ship answers with a quiet confidence, as if the hull recognizes a familiar touch. But there are things a man cannot replace. The warmth of a mother's palm, a sudden laugh in the dark, the soft shock of tears. Varroc does not forget those entirely. Sometimes, late in the quiet hours, he will pause and hold a civilian child's hand, small and hot, and the servos will whir something almost embarrassed. Even machines make noise when they are unused. The tech priest's faith is a rational religion. They worship patterns, tolerances, and the sanctity of function. To them, machinery is scripture, and the machine god is the poem written in the language of torque and voltage. Their prayers are also diagnostics, a sequence of taps, an incantation-sized run of code, a micro-prayer transmitted in ultrasonic tones to the ship's maintenance arrays. Their rituals comfort them the way rituals have comforted men throughout history, by producing meaning, by saying aloud that chaos can be managed and that every component has place and purpose. Yet ritual is a porous thing. You cannot spend centuries transferring sensation from skin to alloy without a residue of something else. Hunger, perhaps, or a softness for order that nudges toward obsession. The more a tech priest cuts away his frailties, the more a small human ache remains to be placated. Varroc's eyes, one ocular implant and one slow iris of organic tissue, will sometimes linger on the way sunlight falls through a corridor viewport when the emergency shutters have parted for maintenance. Those moments cost him something he would never name, a flicker of longing for a world where a hand could burn on a hot kettle and be forgiven for having done so. Vigilator Crew sees them differently. His life is not a lattice of trimmed circuits, but a series of abrupt decisions made under the stench of fear. Crew's notion of the sacred is a different kind. It is a taut line between a rifle's butt and the soft silence of a child's breathing. Where Varroc speaks in the measured tones of servohums, Crew remembers the human rhythm of being mortal. He knows what it feels like to sleep with a helmet cradled on his chest and to dream of waking without one. Crew is a man who measures time in the number of times the engine has coughed, and each cough is a small emergency resolved. He is affectionate in curt ways, a softened look, a finger laid quickly on a brow to check for fever, a rosary toy he lets a child roll between his calloused fingers. The differences between these men are useful. They create a counterpoint that will matter when the story tightens. For now, their differences produce a small, fragile equilibrium. Ritual and muscle memory, code and blood, steel and bone. The ship is a house built on those chords. It hums, and that hum is their common center. So what is the nature of the tech priest as a figure of human sacrifice to function? It is the slow sedation of error. To trade flesh for gear is not only to improve an arm's precision, it is to remove the possibility of delight and miscalculation. A hand that cannot stumble does not know the pleasure of surprise. It will remove the vulnerability that makes mercy possible. The machine god asks for efficiency. It does not ask, quite explicitly, for gratitude. Devotion dies in a place where everything is always right, and where devotion is dead, ritual remains, hollow, echoing, but still warm enough to keep fear at bay. Now to the other side of the ledger, the Tyranid. If the tech priests are the sound of code, the Tyranid is an appetite expressed in 1,000 mouths. The Tyranid is not an enemy crafted of malice, so much as a force of appetite that takes form according to the shapes it must devour. Where a tech priest thinks in tolerances and tolerances breed the promise of longevity, The Tyranid computes in consumption. Imagine a storm that has rearranged its clouds into teeth. Imagine that storm learning, adapting, shaping itself to bite more effectively. There is no individual Tyranid soul to name, no single mind to pity. There is only the Hive Mind, a gestalt intelligence that is more weather than person, more pressure than argument. The first way the crew learns about the Tyranid is simple and humiliating. It smells wrong. The Augur Priest will note it in sequences and charts. But even before the Auspex has parsed molecules, the crew will feel a wrongness on their tongues. The air carries a sweetness like sugar left too long in the sun, mixed with a metallic tang that speaks of raw iron and salt. Sometimes the smell is described by the crew as hunger. But it is not hunger that belongs to a single throat. It is the smell of an organism so vast that its edges blur. When a Tyranid spore blooms, it does not sprout a single creature. It releases a grammar of bodies designed to speak the language of consumption. Tyranids adapt. Their biology does not waste itself on permanence. It is a library of solutions that the Hive Mind borrows from and discards. A claw may be useful on one world, a barbed proboscis on another. If a planet is thick with carbonate jungles, the Tyranid that eats there will sprout filtering plates tuned for mineral ingestion. If the planet is a frozen smear, thick blubber and slow metabolism arise as if by a thought. It is an intelligence of adaptation that seems, by any human measure, elegant. And this strain of elegance is what makes the idea of the Tyranid more than a fairy tale to those who have faced them. It makes them inevitability in an ecological form. Where there is life worth eating, there will be Tyranid strategies to eat it. Yet adaptation is not merely physical, it is communicative. Small Tyranid organisms release pheromones and psychic murmurs that the Hive Mind uses like a conductor uses a baton. A sensory storm is raised, subtle scents and low, unnameable sounds that tell 1,000 bodies to turn a direction, to press a flank, to soften a hold. In the dark corners of a ship, these currents can be misread for a draft. In a man's skull, they sound like nothing at all until he is suddenly thinking the same thought as another person at the other side of an airlock. Move, strike, feed. The human mind does not like being so easily coerced. It flinches as if someone else had touched it without permission. The terror of the Tyranid is slow in one sense and blindingly quick in another. In open space assaults, they may arrive in swarms that move with a terrible, coordinated purpose, smashing, burrowing, consuming. In larger campaigns, their advance is a geological event, an entire biosphere retooled over months or years into a Tyranid feeding ground. The geological metaphor matters because the Tyranid uses the long, slow scale and the brief, violent moment with equal cruelty. They make the slow world fast and the fast world slow. Now put these two things together in a single ship's corridor, the precise rituals of metal and the patient chemistry of the hive. The contrast is instructive not just for the story, but for the men who must stand in it. Tech priests think in the language of problem and answer. Tyranids present a series of problems for which answers cannot be invented in time. The Augur Priest will read the sensors and compose contingencies. He will stack probabilities like a prayer. The Tyranid will change the variables mid-sentence and smile with its absence of a mouth. There is also a philosophical symmetry between worshipping a machine god and facing a hive mind. Both practices deny the individual, but in opposite ways. The tech priest surrenders individuality to impose a mechanical order upon it. The Tyranid dissolves individuality by absorbing it, by literally feeding on the bodies and genetic material of others to become larger, smarter, and more fit. One path erases the human by substituting process. The other erases it by consumption. Both are annihilations of a sort. Both leave little rooms in which a person might breathe at first and then find those rooms closing. Mara Leston sees this most clearly. Her work is a small island of tenderness amid those broad philosophical ties. She stitches gashes and replaces sutures with braided fiber, and stitches a man's jaw back together with a patience that can be mistaken for prayer. To Mara, each repair is a protest, an insistence that a life is a thing worth the inconvenience of saving. She tends to burns and punctures and the odd, alien bruises men bring back from scouted worlds, the shadowed telltales of something that has eaten at the edges of a person's flesh. She spends time with bodies because she can still feel the heat of another person's skin. Her tenderness is a risk. To feel warmth is to remind herself of what she might lose when the hive arrives. This is important because horror is not merely the spectacle of violence. It is the slow attrition of meaning. When a man is turned into a cog, he loses the taste of life. When a man is eaten by Tyranids, the taste of life is forcibly removed. Both are losses that strip story from a life. Crew knows this better than most. He has watched men perform their rituals. He has watched them drift into a machine's calm. And he has also seen men who screamed when the first genestealer clawed through a hull plate and found his mate with the face melted off into an unrecognizable pattern. Those screams do something to the people who hear them. They are a fracture in the slow narrative the ship tells itself. Rituals that once bound the crew together loosen. Conversation dies in the mouth like a burnt taste. The tech priests possess another danger that is quieter, the seduction of certainty. When a man believes that code will save him, he stops looking for other truths. He ceases to hear whispers that might otherwise provide warnings not captured by sensors. This is the kind of blindness that Tyranids exploit. They are not sophisticated in the way an intelligence might be. They are sophisticated in the way grass is tough, adaptive, and indifferent. A crew that counts on the precision of upkeep will not be ready for a biology that says, "Where sensors fail, I will perfume the air. Where I cannot cut through armor, I will evolve teeth that fit the lock." The world is accident-prone. Machines cannot adapt the way life can without being reprogrammed. They must be told to change. Life changes on instinct. And yet, there are contradictions that are almost tender. Varrock loves the ship. He loves the geometry of its wiring and the order of its ducts. He attaches himself to it as a man attaches to a lover, with minor rituals, with the habitual brushing of a tool over a plate, with the quiet sharing of an oil can in the dead hours. Sometimes he will sit with the servo skulls and give them names, so that their small beacons of light feel less like tools and more like company. This anthropomorphization is a small human defiance against the hollowing out of feeling. Naming is an old trick humans use to anchor themselves, but naming something does not make it safe. It only makes the longing for safety louder when safety is gone. A story must, at some point, examine how people misread things and then pay for it. In the case of our ship, the first misread will be an assumption that creatures can be cataloged like spare parts. The Augur Priest will run sims. He will chart trajectories and overlay biome patterns, and with his hands, he will fold the data into tidy briefs. But the Tyranid will do what storms do, fold around the edges of those briefs and unsettle them. The crew will find that their maps are not wrong so much as incomplete. The gap between completeness and the real thing is a yawning space through which dread can move with a delicious slowness. One night, sometime after the sample of fibrous matter was sealed away, the Augur Priest shares a private reading with Varrock. The lights around them are dim amber, and the hum of the engines is the only steady companionship. The Augur Priest, thin, hairless, eyes rimmed like a scholar's pages, traces a line across a hollow display. Small, pulsing blips arrange and rearrange themselves. He does not use the sharp word Tyranid. He does not need to. He says instead, "This is an organism whose landscape is appetite. It does not hunger for a palace or a city. It hungers for the code of life itself, its recipes, its tissues, the biochemical grammar of planet and being." Varrock listens. He understands pattern. He understands systems and failures. He nods, and for the first time his voice is small, as if the word he carries might crack. "We will do what we can," he says. "It is not a promise of salvation. It is the practice of faith in a circumstance that is not designed to be saved from." The chapter must not end with an answer. That would be to promise a safety that the world does not grant. Instead, it ends with questions rubbed into the metal of the ship like worn handholds. How much of a man can be replaced before he is no longer a man? If identity is shared and chewed by a swarm, what remains of the story that was once inside him? When machinery and biology meet, which will give way and which will conquer? The tech priest reduces uncertainty by culturing certainty. The hive mind absorbs certainty into its own appetite. Both are vast and both are quiet in their inevitability. Before we leave this chapter, listen for small details you might otherwise discard. Note the way a servo skull repositions its light over a corner where it should not be. Listen to the augur priest's throat shift as he hums a microliturgy. Feel the sudden, inexplicable itch that a guardsman will sometimes try to ignore on the inside of his forearm. These are the little perturbations the story uses as thread. They will not feel like a drumbeat yet. They will feel like a pebble placed on a smooth table. Later, when the table tilts, you will remember the pebble and recognize how small beginnings make enormous ends inevitable. And finally, remember hunger. Not as a single shape, but as a weather. It will not announce itself with banners. It will smell perfumed on the air. It will rearrange the hiss in the vents. It will make the servos click in rhythm with something beyond their programming. Varrock and Crew and Mara and the augur priest will anchor themselves into the routines that have kept them safe until now. Those routines will be their armor, and armor, however polished, can be eaten around. Hold the quiet image of the ship again. Lights dim to amber, the priests at their consoles, a child in a warm lap, the hush. Let that image be the reference point for everything to come. In the distance that is not measured by screens but by the slow tightening of a chest, the shape of a storm is learning the contours of the vessel. It is learning what can be eaten and what must be sliced away. It has patience, and patience is a kind of cruelty that does not hurry. When the next chapter begins, the first small things will have folded into larger consequences. Ritual will fray, instincts will sharpen, and hunger will move from a scent at the edge of perception to a chorus in the marrow. For now, keep breathing with the ship, with the priests and the guards and the child. The world is a quiet place, full of measurement and meaning. It is also, quietly and persistently, something that will not be measured into safety. Speak softly now. Keep the same slow breath you used while the ship sang its lullaby. Let the voice settle into the marrow of the story like a hand laid on a sleeping brow. We will spend these hours moving through corridors that smell faintly of oil and old prayers, touching the thin places where comfort meets the first, almost laughable misalignments. The aim here is not sudden terror, but the tiny, accumulating errors that make terror inevitable. Listen for the small noises. They are patient. The day, if days can exist aboard a ship that has no sky, begins with a maintenance sweep. It is ordinary. Servo arms swing, pneumatic hoses sigh, and the servo skulls orbit like lanterns above newly oiled panels. Crew and a pair of guardsmen move through the bowels of the hull, boots soundless on the non-slip plating as they check seals and pressure valves. Crew hums without meaning to, a short tune that belongs to a warm world he can no longer visit. It keeps his hands steady. He is a man who trusts the muscle memory of routine. He has seen many things in service and has learned to make the world obey by simply touching the right things. On the maintenance drone's feed, a corner of a service bay flashes with an anomaly. A gloved hand shields the monitor as the image resolves. A smear along an internal strut, a dark, fibrous webbing matted into a seam where insulation should be plain. It is small, no larger than a cupped palm, but it is wrong. The drone returns the sample to a secure transport cradle like a guilty thing bringing back evidence of another's presence. The crate is sealed and moved to the diagnostics deck. Proper procedure. Calm responses. The ship's ritual smooth over the imperfection like a pressed hand smoothing wrinkled fabric. Mara is there when the crate opens. She lifts the fragment, gloves on, eyes narrowed with the careful light of someone who knows how to read tissue. and inhales because it is part of her work to know what things smell like. Her nose flinches as if she has touched something hot. The odor is layered, a sweetness that smells like sugar left to spoil, undercut by the metallic tang of fresh blood, and beneath that a faint ozone note that the augur priest mentally tags as foreign. The sensory impression travels down her spine like a hand. She lays the fragment into an analyzer tray and watches the machine scan. Soft, translated lines trace the sample's composition across a hollow. Protein signatures blink in unfamiliar sequences. Carbohydrate matrices are skewed. There are cells within the fragment that do not match any standard taxonomy on the ship's databases. The diagnostic returns a no-match flag, and a mild priority alert that the augur priest will tuck away as a curiosity for later. Curiosity is a dangerous incubator in a world that survives on certainty. The augur priest, thin as parchment and precise as a cut coin, takes the data and runs it through routines. He overlays it with satellite readings, with the grimy, patient charts of previous supply drops, and with biosignatures pulled from old reports. He finds patterns that seem to fold back into themselves, slight variations in the polarities of certain amino bonds that suggest rapid alteration, a hint of enzymatic activity that seems too young to have come from ancient fossilization. He marks the sample as anomalous but not immediately threatening. He writes notes in the margins and seals them for the Dominus to read. Varrock reads and his fingers drum a slow morse against the steel of his knee. He is a man of ordered reaction. He understands marginal failures and knows how to patch them into a new status quo. He will not panic. He will sanitize and recalibrate and name the error so that it can be handled. That is his work and his comfort. But even the calmest man keeps a bank of small worries in an inaccessible chamber to which he only admits in private. Tonight his private ledger grows a single line. Unknown organic trace, proximity, nearby system. He runs a simulation in his head, a litany of contingencies organizing themselves like prayer beads. The beads click in an order that does not feel right. While he considers this, one of the guardsmen, Maris, a young man more accustomed to the yucca flats of his home world than to the disciplined quiet of ship life, feels an itch beneath his armband. He rubs it absently and tells himself it is nothing, friction from his armor, a reaction to synthetic fabric. The itch will come and go, a small insistence beneath the epidermis. He will not say anything at first because men like Maris are taught that small complaints are a kind of ill discipline. He will tuck the sensation into his sleep, because sleeping is how the day keeps its peace. It is an effective strategy. For a day, the fragment remains an uneasy footnote. Containers are quarantined. A minor decontamination sweep is run in the service bay. The servoskulls blink with polite curiosity. The children in the communal ward run feet, first into a game of names, shouting enough to make the adults smile, and Mara hums while stitching a new seam into an evac's cloak. Routine is a kind of armor. It masks the small abrasions of the world. Then the ship coughs. It is not a violent thing. Engines do not explode in the corridors of this beginning. Instead, the hum of the primary array skews by a few hertz, a frequency shift so slight that only those who listen for it, a handful of priests and mechanics, notice. The servoskulls blink in unison for an extra beat, their small lights flaring with a pattern no one recognizes. A pipe stutters and hiccups, shedding a microfog that tastes faintly wrong in the mouth. The augur priest looks up the way someone notices a shadow move in a picture they have seen 1,000 times. He runs a diagnostic. The screens return nothing unusual. The instruments insist everything is nominal. Instruments can lie in the presence of life not cataloged. They can be deceived by novelty, the way a child is deceived by a mirror. The augur priest clears his throat and tells a small, private joke without humor. Perhaps the ship dreams. It is an attempt at levity, and for a dozen minutes the laughter is enough. Then Maris wakes from where he has dozed in a passage alcove and says, with a curious honesty, I keep hearing something like fingernails. That is when voices become conspirators. Words have a contagious quality in corridors swallowed by a hush. Mari's statement is a pebble dropped into water. Others hear it and repeat it, and the sound becomes a chorus and then a litany. Someone replies that it's probably a loose plate. Someone else that the air recycling makes such noises in certain temp ranges. Crew, older and wiser, half scolds and half laughs it away, but his eyes keep flicking toward the ducts where the sound seemed to originate. Mara is the first to find an actual cause. She gets up in the night to check on the evac children and finds one of them coughing, the breath rattling in a way that sounds wrong for a human lung. The child's lips are a darker shade, as though iron were pressed beneath the skin. Mara presses a hand to the child's forehead and finds heat. The small body trembles as if a fever rhythm rolls under the skin. She takes a tiny swab from the child's mouth and watches the sample bloom under the scanner. The results whisper a note the augur priest will later describe as awkwardly correct and horribly new. There are spores in the saliva, minute and crystalline. Not spores, but something close, structures that cling and then invite. The words invasive microbial appear on the hollow and make a sound like a bell clacking against a bowl. The crew responds the way ships are taught: isolation, antiseptics, antivirals. They set up an isolation ward in a sealed compartment and bring forward the limited medical gear that can be spared. They run the sample, amplify the imaging. Under a magnified light, the spores look almost comically precise. Crystalline filaments like tiny stars with barbs that hook into tissue. They are not inert. They pulse faintly with internal chemical cycling. The augur priest's display shows a faint, coherent pattern in the pulses, a rhythm repeated only a few times, like footsteps in a long hallway. Varrock holds the image long and then says softly, "It is not yet a swarm." The line is meant to comfort as much as to record technical fact, but the word "yet" is a hinge that creaks. Even as he speaks it, there is a sensation among the crew like a breath held too long. The next day, another anomaly appears. A cargo hold that had been sealed for months, used to store non-essential fabric and old commemorative metals, shows an acid scar along one of its plating seams, a shallow channel eaten through alloy and revealing the insulation beneath, which in turn shows the delicate webbing that first alarmed the maintenance drone. The scar is old, not fresh, paint bubbled and worn away around it, but it is also actively oozing a gelatinous residue that smells faintly like burnt sugar. The guards patch it as procedure prescribes, but fingers move slower. People check their tools like men checking that they left the hearth fire burning. In private, a few men murmur of other things. Stories of salvage runs where hulls came home shredded by teeth that left patterns like script. Rumors from other sectors. Planets found with forests stripped clean, empty shells of cities whose air tasted of the same sickly sweet tang. There are whisper networks on the ship, brittle and gossamer. They link with the older sailors' memories of nests, and the augur priest makes notes that he will never show the civilians. Something else changes in human bodies, dreams. Sleep becomes uneasy. The children dream of things without faces that press close until their hands are wet with sweat. A guard wakes with his mouth full of blood, spitting into the night like an animal trying to dislodge a bitter seed. A technician, usually even-tempered, begins to mutter in his sleep, repeating a phrase in a language none on board recognize. A clicking cadence that resembles the sound the maintenance drone recorded that first day. People notice when another repeats a word in their sleep, and then they start to notice how the words sometimes line up, as if a chorus of minds is learning the same nursery rhyme. The crew attempts to anchor themselves. More patrols, more checks of the air filters, ritualized cleansing of communal spaces. The tech priests perform rites over the vents, whispering maintenance hymns into the ducts the way one might pray into a well. They pour oil over joints and run code that reboots environmental arrays. Their actions are purposeful and correct, and for a while the ship obeys them, as if it were simply a machine that could be coaxed back to protocol. But what the priests cannot see, not with tools, not with prayer, is that the thing that moves in the ship is less a presence than a pattern. The spores and the fibrous matter and the odd aciding of a bulkhead are not identical events so much as variations on a single grammar. Each instance is a phrase, and when chained together, they form an argument the crew cannot yet read. One night, while observing a maintenance hatch, crew finds a small score upon the inside rim of the plate. Many, many tiny nicks, like the marks a small creature might make, too regular to be random. He runs a gloved finger across them, and his pulse does something peculiar, quick and cold as if a current had run through him. He photographs the marks, sends them to Varrock, and says in a whisper that is equal parts duty and fear, "They're learning the ship." The words hang between them like a coin spinning its last round. Varrock, whose faith is in the sanctity of components, answers with the language of repair and probability. They map, all life maps. We will adapt, we always have. To adapt, however, requires perception. Adaptation requires the recognition that the environment has changed in a way your existing repertoire will not address. Machines can be updated, but they must be told how. The Tyranid pattern does not stop to be told. A deeper unease begins to radiate from the holoscreens. The Auspex readings that once returned neat lines and numbers now show ghostly blooms on the peripheries of their scans, smudged halos of data that flicker in and out like the afterimage of a light. The augur priest calls the crew to a meeting and speaks slowly because he knows how language can either anchor a group or scatter them like birds. He draws the patterns, repeating pulses with increasing amplitude, faint, synchronous spikes in biometrics across different decks. There is communication, he says, and his voice is grainy because the word communication in that context is not comforting. When humans use that word, they often mean understanding, and understanding gives a direction for action. This is not understanding. This is something else. Coordination at a scale they do not control. Mara finds that the infected react badly to touch. When she puts her hand on a child's forehead, the fevered skin is hot, but beneath the heat the flesh feels oddly dry, as if tissues are being stripped of their moisture in some microscopic process. The bandages she applies sometimes come away with faintly viscous strands attached, filaments that cling like the remains of a spider web on a sore fingertip. These filaments do not simply pull, they anchor. Mara peels them away with careful hands, and the child cries not only in pain, but in a way that sounds like fear of being unfinished. Mara tells herself that she will not be the one to say the word aloud, mutation, because saying that makes the thing a story rather than an object to fix. But at night she cannot unsee the microscopic barbs clinging like teeth to living skin. And there are the auditory anomalies too. It begins with the tiniest sound, a rhythm that seems to click in the vents. At first, the pattern is irregular and could be a system jitter, but in the quiet hours the clicks begin to fuse into something the brain can lock onto. Some nights the pattern is slow and patient, like a metronome counting out time for a calm, endless march. Other nights it is staccato and angry, like claws running across a rib. Men begin to hear things in their sleep, not only in their waking hours. Crew dreams of someone breathing behind him in the dark and wakes with the taste of iron in his mouth. He checks his rifle in the dim light as if armor is a talisman that will ward off a dream. Rituals fray. A tech priest forgets a line in a maintenance hymn, and the servos stutter with some new, embarrassed rhythm. The servo skulls blink in unusual sequences, sweeping light over corners they never swept before and pausing as if listening. The crew notices that a particular corridor, Deck 7 aft, has a temperature dip that only shows in the micro-reads of certain instruments. The dip is so slight most would ignore it, but to those paying attention, it feels like the breath of a thing passing through the metal. Instruments that once offered certainty are beginning to hesitate. A single, unnerving event finally breaks the fragile equilibrium. A scavenger drone, sent down to retrieve an old maintenance panel from a service shaft, returns jammed and silent when the drone is pried open. The mechanism that once cleaned and polished the hull is found ensnared in tiny filaments, its joints fused with a clear, resinous secretion. Embedded within the resin are pale, chitinous fragments, no larger than a fingernail, that look almost like the ridged segment of an insect's exoskeleton. The fragments are not identical to any known species in the ship's database. They glint in the light with a wet, purposeful sheen. The image of that resin and the faint, ridged fragments has a peculiar effect on people. It is the first concrete thing that cannot be explained away by maintenance error or old rust. It looks like the beginnings of an organism, and that beginning is what ruins the crew's ability to feel comfort. It is not yet a body. It is a promise of bodies. When Varrock sees the photographs, his hands shake for the first time in the narrative we have traced so far. He runs his thumb over the image and finds sweat beneath the metal plate of his hand. Sweat that is, by his nature, an embarrassment. The augur priest speaks, and the word he uses is not technical, incipient. It is a word that means at the beginning, and in its syllables the crew hears the shape of their own unspooling. They do not panic. Panic is a blunt instrument and they are trained to be precise. But they begin to prepare like men who have seen a storm's first, fainting flares on the horizon. Longer watches, more sterilization cycles, a quiet hand on rifles. The weight of preparation settles into the hull like settled snow, quiet, compacting, inevitable. It gives them the illusion of action. The chapter closes on a small, terrible stillness. A child in the ward whispers in half-sleep, and the phrase she uses is not a child's play, but a soft, curving sound like a note left too long. It is a sound the augur priest cross-references, and finds a pattern he cannot fit to any known lexicon. He writes the pattern down and pins it to a board with a small, trembling thumb. Outside, the ship's hull hums its low song. Within the hull, something that learned to whisper is learning its lines. The crew will look back and remember these small things. The fragment, the itch, the resin, a child's half-remembered sound. They will remember the way the servoskulls paused and the way their own sleep started to fracture. They will remember the small, patient noises like fingernails that turned out not to be fingernails at all. For now, the terror is still a rumor the way thunder is a rumor before rain. It gathers in the throat. It sharpens the ears. It teaches the men of the ship to hold their breath between heartbeats. And as they do, something beyond number consults its chart and decides, with the uncompromising logic of appetite, how best to begin. Begin as if nothing new has arrived, breathe slow, let the sound be steady and quiet. The ship still sings its ancient hymn, but the song has lost a seam of certainty. A note now hangs an instant too long and then cracks. This chapter stretches that crack and steps closer until the sound becomes a different thing entirely. The aim is not to shout. The aim is to let dread gather and swell like a held breath until the whole body must respond. For several days after the resin and the resin fragments were found, the crew lived in a rhythm of mitigation. They scrubbed, they sealed, they rehearsed contingencies, and their actions kept panic at bay. But rituals can only patch what rituals are built to mend. They cannot stitch a grammar into being when the other side speaks only in appetite and adaptation. Patterns compound, small errors multiply. The first true change is not a single monstrous event, but an accretion of misreads and missed warnings, of micro-failures the crew cannot see for the work they are doing to keep visible things right. It begins with the power. Power does odd things to people. It gives a man a sense of control that is intoxicating. The ship's primary arrays, old and well-maintained, had always hummed with the comfortable certainty of a thing that will continue unless physically broken. Then, in the span of 2 heartbeats, a ward went dark. Not a grand blackout, not a spectacular failure announced by alarms and flashes, but a precise, surgical cutting of lights and feed to Deck 7 aft, where the maintenance hatch had first been scarred. The lumen globes died in a line like blown-out candles. Emergency strips flickered on with weak, saturated red, and the corridor, familiar and mapped by muscle, became an interval of unknown. A dying light changes the way sound behaves. Under normal illumination, the mind maps space not only by vision but by the assurance of detail. Where pipes bend, how paint flakes near a seam, whether a vent has a hair of rust. In the soft red the shadows swell and merge. Depth collapses into texture. Crew led a patrol down that corridor with weapons up, breath slow, boots silent. He counted the steps by feeling the plated ridges under his soles. Each step was a metronome beat in a song he had practiced his whole life. From somewhere deep in the hull came a sound the human mind understands before it translates. A skittering, a scraping that could be a loose cable, a tool dropped, a rat among the ducts. The patrol paused, trained eyes straining at angles where the light could not reach. The servo skulls, usually orbiting like mechanical moths, stalled mid-orbit and their lights remained fixed on a dark junction. Their sensors, made to interrogate matter, now hesitated, as if looking at something their codices had not anticipated. The air itself bent. In the pause before action, a thought foreign and small like a seed took root in Crew's mind, that they were not alone in the hull in a manner their instruments could catalog. It was instinct raw and animal. He could not explain why his palms prickled under gauntlets. He barked an order to sweep. The guardsmen moved with practiced efficiency, bayonets and rounds ready. The sound stopped. The corridor breathed again. Relief washed over them like warm water. This relief was thin and temporary. Across the ship, the augur priest watched his holoscreens and frowned at an anomaly, micropsychic interference. The term itself was old and freighted, used for storms and warp eddies and nervous sailors' superstition. He calibrated arrays and tuned filters, but the interference did not fall neatly into the categories he knew. It had a timbre, rising, feminine in its long vowels, like a chorus he could not fully hear. He sent a query to Fleet Nets and received only static in answer. Varrock, from his alcove of worn tools, listened to the priest describe the pattern and felt his own implants twitch with an unaccounted-for feedback. A tiny LED on his ocular implant blinked a warning he had never assigned. The Tyranid methodology is not all at once. It is an economy of probe and overwhelm. It tests with small, undramatic touches and watches for reaction. If it finds a gap, behavioral, mechanical, spiritual, it will go deeper. The first probes do not scream. They whisper, they ask, they watch. Not all probes are biological. The Hive Mind uses whatever channels it can find. It has a patience with which to learn the languages of others, and it can. The crew would later learn with a kind of horror, whisper through the seams of code when given a thin enough place to wedge a filament. A maintenance bus, that most trusted of conveyances, returned once with its control bus contaminated by the same resinous secretion. Small polymer threads had curled into connectors. At scale, the contamination was slow-burning corruption, sensor jitter, false negative flags, a tiny latency in response that knit together into an opportunity. When a servo arm hesitates, a hand gets cut. When sensors jitter, a flank is left unmapped. The Tyranid does not need to be logical. It needs only to be relentless. Rooms began to misbehave. A storeroom door that used to respond to contact switches sat stubbornly locked for a breath too long, and then gave with a soft, wet sound like flesh parting. An environmental vent coughed and spat out a fine spray that smelled like the sugar and iron sweetness the crew now associated with wrongness. Someone opened a maintenance panel and found the cables braided through with fibers that glowed faintly under ultraviolet veins made of polymer and protein. The sight of those veins put a pressure in the chest, like the first time a man understands how much he loves something. A small, sharp fear. Bodies began to betray a different economy of response. Mari's itch deepened. He scratched at the inside of his arm one evening and felt a small bump beneath the skin, no larger than a grain. He told no one at first. A soldier with a patch of something odd upon him is a liability in a tight-quartered ship. Men learn to bury wounds. That night, though, he could not sleep. The bump multiplied in sensation, a minor pressure that crawled, an itch that arranged itself into patterns. He woke in the middle of a watch with his fingers slick and stained, the skin beneath his glove torn where he had tried to pry at it with impatient nails. The wound had a small, dark seed in its center, a bead of something that seemed almost crystalline. Mara was reluctant, professional hand steady, but when she drew the bead for analysis, her face shifted in a way she had learned to read as, "This is beyond common." The bead's surface was minutely tessellated. It rolled on the tray like a sleeping insect whose carapace had been polished. Not all bodies wore the invader so politely. Some reacted violently. The first full-on change came invisible, in dream. A technician woke screaming with his lungs raw, spittle bloody. His fingers clawed into his own throat. He said nonsense for 2 hours, phrases in a rhythm that matched the clicks the maintenance drone had recorded. In the ward, a child's eyes rolled oddly, and then, with horrifying speed, a small membranous growth unfolded like a petal under their skin and burst outward with a wet, greenish ooze. The nurses acted fast. Mara pressed salves and seared tissue closed. The child was placed under sedation and a field of antiseptic and cleansers. The doctors worked like surgeons cutting a riverbed. They were competent and precise, and their competence did not stop the sound from being the sound of a thing being torn away. The emotional economy of the ship shifted. People who had hitherto been steady became brittle. Conversations dissolved into clipped sentences and null appointments. No one wanted to eat in the mess unless they were forced. The taste of the food suddenly metallic in their mouths, as if everything had a layer of iron over it. Laughter thinned to a brittle habitude that no longer satisfied. Prayers multiplied in the alcoves like spiders weaving their traps tighter. The tech priest's confidence eroded into a different shape of obsession. Varuk, who had once comforted servoskulls by naming them, began naming failures instead. Each small fail was a thing to be catalogued, cross-referenced, and blamed. He sat with the maintenance logs and let his mind comb and comb, seeking a string of causality that would tie a neat bow around the problem. He found patterns. One could always find patterns when you had a mind trained to look, but they were not comforting patterns. The errors were not random enough to be mere decay, and not ordered enough to be a simple attack. They looked instead like a slow learning curve. At nights in the dim, Varuk would go alone to the ducts and press his ear to cold metal. He listened to a clicking rhythm inside the walls he could not map. It was not one voice. It was many, layered and overlapping, as if a chorus rehearsed in the dark. When he traced the rhythm through hand signals to the augur priest, the priest's eyes widened in a professional panic that nobody had before seen. Priests are taught to measure anomaly without melodrama. He was measuring something that altered the parameters of measurement. The assault changed scale when doors began to open in ways they should not. Airlocks that had been sealed for safety jutted open with a nauseous slowness, their hydraulic systems compromised by filaments having fused into their actuators. A patrol sent to check a service bay came back with its boots stained a new shade of red. Not explosive fire, but thin, tarry ichor that smelled faintly sweet. They did not speak for hours. The ichor had smeared patterns on the plating that looked like mapping, a cartography of something not yet fully seen. It is in the small betrayals of trust that fear uncoils. The servos that had been friends now paused at the edge of a task and then continued with a tiny lag. The armor itself, the shell these men trusted, began to smart in places where skin met metal. Warriors who had never known their hands to shake felt an odd tremor when they gripped a grip. The recoil of a rifle became an old adversary, and every controlled fire felt heavier, as if inertia had grown teeth. Outside, the ancient sensors finally showed something concrete. A small cloud, not a planet but a bloom of spore, drifted on their long-range plates. It was not a single projectile but a cloud of particulate, each mote a seed of chemistry. The augur priest called a council and spelled it out with the calm habit of someone delivering bad code to a compromised system. The sensors could not give them a trajectory, only a pattern, an arithmetic of probability whose result, when fed into their contingency models, bloomed into a single word none wished to say: infiltration. The cloud, small and invisible to normal eyes, had the architecture of intent. It was not wind, it was placement. That night the ship lost a worker. He was not a soldier but a quiet man whose hands knew the seams of vents as if they were grooves on musical instruments. He had been scraping scale from an inaccessible elbow of piping and had not returned. Search parties went in with flashlamps and listening devices. They found only the scrape marks and on the brown, polished steel, a shallow ring of impressions, prints too small for a human palm, and thin, ridged fragments like those from the drone. The pattern of the ring looked practiced, as if a small hand had learned exactly where to press to make an access panel give up its secrets. They found a smear of residue that smelled, in the memory of the augur priest, like burnt sugar. They found a tiny curl of polymer and protein, and they found a smear of the same ichor that had stained the patrol's boots. The man's boots lay nearby, neat and parallel as if placed there. They were empty. It is the details that make a catastrophe honest. That man's last act, whoever or whatever had taken him, was not the frenzied rending of flesh the crew had feared. It was the silence of a man scooped up and put aside. The emptiness of that scene dug into people more than gore might have. It introduced the idea that loss need not be dramatic to be absolute. It made the ship feel less like a home and more like a set piece for a theater in which the actors were being quietly removed. As the days shortened into an indeterminate cycle of watch and repair, the ship's internal map reconfigured itself in a way the crew could not wholly foresee. Entire corridors became avoided like rooms one might not speak of in a house. Deck 7 aft was a place where the air felt wrong. They placed wards and sigils and outer light arrays, but the place simply stopped being well defined. The servo skulls would not pass certain thresholds and would pause with a dithering hum as if considering whether to proceed. The mere presence of those pauses was a violence to the crew's sense of technical confidence. And then the whispering began. It started in a dozen small, disparate places. A child waking and repeating a phrase in half-sleep. A mechanic muttering a cadence under his breath as he tightened bolts. A priest sniffing and leaning toward the ducts as if to hear more clearly. The phrases themselves were not coherent in the sense of language. They were rhythms, patterns of clicks and sibilants that could be mistaken for machine noise. But when people repeated them in the same rooms, the cadence matched, not exact syllable for syllable, but with an uncanny alignment that suggested something had taught them a beat to follow. It is likely that the hive mind did not intend to teach. It intended to infiltrate. Teaching was a side effect. The spores and filaments that rained through the vents did not so much instruct as tune the minds they touched to the same frequency. A chorus grows from a single note when many voices unknowingly choose to sing it. So too, did a chorus of small willing and unwilling minds begin to harmonize with a different key. Those who were most vulnerable, children, the frail, those recently grafted with new augmetics that had not yet fully integrated, showed the fastest changes. Their eyes drifted. Their attention lengthened in a way that looked like prayer but felt like tuning. They would stare at a point in space and smile without pleasure. At the mess, a woman cut her bread and watched the crumbs fall in a rhythm, then set down her knife as if shocked that she had been the one moving. Some resisted with a furious animal energy. The first real outbreak of violence was not from without but within. A man in the isolation ward, frightened and fevered, lunged at a medic and bit deep into an arm. Blood and a wash of panic followed. The bite carried with it the same crystalline bead that had once been found beneath Mari's skin. The bite was closed and sutured, and the medic survived. But the incident introduced a dread that could not be washed by antiseptic. If infection could spread not only through the body but through action, through the simple contact of teeth upon skin, then the ship had become a place where choice itself could be dangerous. By now, the tech priests had altered their rituals. Where once they performed maintenance with calm, methodical hands, they now moved like surgeons racing. Varrock began to speak in clipped sentences, and his prayers acquired a staccato edge. The machine liturgy gained an undertone of supplication. He tried to update the systems, to write new code that would recognize biological contamination within the bus control. But the codes syntactically invalidated themselves in the presence of filaments curled in connectors. The machine resisted being taught what it had not seen. The biological invasion resisted being legislated away by textual commands. As a final, unmistakable escalation, genestealers, the sharp, lithe predators the crew had feared in scrapbooks and nightmares, struck the first clear, violent blow. They did not smash a bulkhead like a tidal wave. They slipped. In the halfway hours between watch rotations, when men were tired and sensors were still learning to read the new noise, a patrol reported movement within a duct. 2 guards peered into the shadow and saw a pale, bullet-shaped head. Before they could react, the creature flowed out like oil and into their ranks. The gasp and clang of rifles was followed by screams that spun and then were cut like thread. The genestealer's limbs were cold and fast, and the world angle shifted into a geometry of pain and speed that cameras could not parse. The 2 men were gone in less time than it takes to swallow fear. Where they had stood were only marks on the plating, the faint smear of ichor and ragged, impossible gouges. When the rest of the patrol fought back, the genestealer's motions were not those of an individual, but of an algorithm enacted in flesh. It struck again with surgical precision and retreated back into the seams as if it had never been. The ship, once a known quantity to the guardsmen, had new rules now. Do not aim at empty space, for empty space could be a mouth. Do not assume the vent will protect you. Do not assume an object that appears inert will remain so. Panic followed dread and then braided into an uglier practical thing. Decision. Leaders must decide. Decisions will be imperfect. Crew called for the muster and for a purge of all non-essential corridors. He organized teams to sweep an area and then seal it. He ordered guns to be kept loaded and bayonets sharpened. Men obeyed because obedience in such hours is a kind of prayer. But obedience makes bodies predictable, and predictability makes patterns easier for the hive mind to swallow whole. The crescendo tightened. The ship itself, an organism of metal and habit, began to exhibit symptoms that the crew recognized too late. Control systems stuttering, doors opening to let pests in, vents bringing in new scents like invitations. The servoskulls that used to be watchful aides now aborted their tasks mid-arc and sat like blind birds at the lip of their routines. The machine gods hemmed thin. In its place rose a new undertone, a low, chorus-like resonance under the ship's hull that the augur priest at last recognized as not wholly machine and not wholly organism. He called it, with the professional terror of a man who has named a plague, the hive's hum. By the close of this period, the crew had learned 3 new things: that the Tyranid did not respect human rhythm, that it had found ways to speak in the ship's tongue, and that whatever it was doing, it was patient. They also learned that their own bodies could betray them, that hands could hold a rifle 1 second and become instruments of transmission the next. They learned that sanctity, ritual, and code were not wholly protective. They learned with the slow, toothy certainty of fate that walls could be hollowed from within, and the shadow waited. It learned their names from the way they said them in the dark. It collected small tastes of fear, of hunger, of iron, and folded them into its own syntax. It made the ship a lesson in adaptability. Find the smallest crack and widen it until the whole house can be rearranged. The crescendo did not have a single peak. It was a tense that lengthened and drew taut until the inevitable snap loomed just beyond the corner they could see. The crew bowed collectively and prepared to see if their armor would hold when the snap came. Hold your breath with them now. Let the sound of the hull be the sound you listen for. The next chapter will not be a longer wind, but a faster one, fewer breaths between the beats, more panic in the chest, and then chaos quick as flame. The shadow will move from the margin to the center, and the ship will begin to understand that nothing inside it is guaranteed to remain what it was. When the crescendo breaks, it does not do so like a single crack of thunder. It breaks like an unzipping, an unraveling that begins at the edge of everything you thought steady and runs with impossible speed until the seam is gone. Prepare yourself for rapid breaths. The narration accelerates with the characters' panic. The lights will stutter swifter than before. Voices will short. Decisions will be taken and then taken back. By the time the ship truly understands what has invaded it, it will already be too late to call the number of those who remain unchanged. The first true breach is not a moment so much as a series of moments layered and overlapping, each folding into the next without respite. One instant Varrock stands in his alcove, palms on a console, aligning conductance matrices. The next, an entire section of the maintenance corridor dissolves into a tableau of claws and teeth, and the wet, obscene geometry of Tyranid forms. The sound of the hull becomes a new orchestra, the shriek of unlubricated joints, the crack of flesh against plating, the low, inhuman chorus that is both many and one. It is the Hive Mind speaking in a volume previously reserved for storms. They come as much through failure as through force. The maintenance bus that had been compromised earlier, the one with threads of polymer curling in its control bus, is commandeered by a bulkhead that should not open. Actuation servos that once obeyed the clean logic of code stutter under the influence of filaments. A latch hulks and gives with a thin metallic shrug. A 30-man team is cut to pieces before the alarms have time to think. Crew hears the first scream, and it is a sound that fractures his bones. He runs without order, because orders are for when there is time to speak. There is none. Genestealers move not like animals, but like answers. Where a person lunges out of reflex, where a rifle is raised, the genestealer is already a step beyond. Limbs telescoping, talons finding the joint between shoulder and chest that all organs leave. They are not graceful in the way a dancer is graceful. They are precise as a scalpel. Because of this precision, the first moments of direct combat look like controlled experiments that ended abruptly wrong. Men bite dust and do not rise. The air is full of the scent they have come to hate, sugar and iron, and beneath it something more ancient, a smell the augur priest will name only later, the smell of being ready. For the soldiers, the obvious tactics are suddenly inadequate. Ranks are flensed. Formations that work on a predictable enemy are useless against something that can predict the physics of a body and move through the same space faster than reflex. Rifles fire and jam. Bolters chuff and then stutter as seals corrode, and the feed mechanisms snag on a residue that is not oil and not rust, but something living. The ammunition is designed for mass and velocity. It is not designed to stop a thing that can fold around projectile force and continue. Men scream. Men howl. Men bite and claw at genestealers and come away with taloned hands and nothing left to bind. Dominus Varrock does what he has always done. He moves toward machines because, in a world of falling men, machines should, in theory, hold. He attempts to reroute power, to force emergency protocols, to bring locked doors to life with a hardware he has loved as if coaxing a lover to speech. He keys sequences into his bionic hand and the matrices respond. For a handful of breaths, doors slam, seals engage, compressor heads scream. The ship answers. Hope flickers like a candle with a draft. Then the lights die. Not whole, not an epic blackout, but the auxiliary feeds that supported those newly engaged protocols fail. Threads of power burn through synthetic filaments embedded in junction boxes. Connections that Varrock attempts to move are fused by resinous secretion into a permanent connection the ship was not designed to have. A servo motor locks. A locker door will not respond. In one corridor, the illumination dies to a single emergency glow. In that glow, the silhouettes that scramble are the wrong proportion. Limbs too many, limbs too jointed. Men look like puppets whose strings have been redirected. Mara moves in the center of the choked alarm with hands that do what they have always done. She presses salves and clamps. She sears shut bleeding mouths. She shouts orders in the harsh voice of a medic whose authority is now the last shield between life and being rewritten. She sees the first bodies that are not merely taken but used. A man's chest cavity, opened by a genestealer's mandible, does not empty blood and organs alone. It sprinkles with patches of polymer crust that glue themselves to ribs like barnacles. From his back, there crawl filaments that flash nervously in the dim light, and one filament finds purchase in the man's throat and twines, and a tiny pod swells under the skin, and then it bursts. The thing that comes out of the pod is wrong in scale and speed, a hatchling with a beak the color of old coins. The child bites and channels the old man's last nerve into a new appetite. The worm thing folds into the ventilation and disappears like the answer to a question no one asked. The augur priest, a man of thin bones and thick rituals, finds his measurements worthless. He has instruments designed to translate the familiar and now watches numbers smear into nonsense. The psychic interference is a roar now, a pressure in his skull. He tries to block it with warding liturgies, old hymns in older tongues, but the noise eats them like moths. He hears voices, layered and soft, as if 1,000 minds were rehearsing the same syllable in the dark. He clutches at his rosary skull and finds that the beads are not comforting. They are warm, as if someone else's hand is holding them too. There's a particular moment when Varrock and crew cross paths in the smoke and the strobe. Neither man can remember volunteering to go down that corridor, but both are there, moving like people pulled by one thread. Crew's face is smeared with blood, a map of the night. His jaw trembles, but he continues to bring order where there is none. Varrock, whose right hand is a set of surgical tools, presses his servo fingers into the wiring of a terminal and tries to pry resin away. He cannot. His tools, made to be precise and patient, grind against something that resembles living glue. He looks at crew, and for the first time in pages of prayer, his voice is not measured. They are in the metal, he says. The statement is not rhetorical. If a machine can be eaten, then the idea of sanctuary is simply architecture that is slowly learning to open. The hive mind does not always lead with monsters that fit the old myths. The titanic forms, the carnifexes, the Molochs are an eventuality, but the first, intimate blows are surgical and intimate. They come through conduits and valves and calibrated acoustic shocks. The ship's psychoacoustic arrays begin to pick up harmonic signatures, a low, oceanic pulse that vibrates the molars. Men think their teeth ache. In some, it is not their teeth, but the small neural arches that connect to their implants. The implants misread the signal as a command. A servolimb twitches, and in that twitch, a man is flayed by his own hand. A platoon near the mess hall experiences it first. One soldier, standing at the coffee dispenser, hears a tone, and his arm moves without him. It moves to a knife on the counter, picks it up, and then that arm slides its blade across his own throat in a motion so calm and precise all present think at first it is an accident. But it is not. The blade is given, guided by a whisper that is not human. The soldier dies with coffee trickling down his chin and a small, sack-like bead in his palm. They find later that the bead is a kind of spore nursery, a microscopic lattice that will release pheromones to which a ship crew responds like cattle to a bell. When the psychotropic weapons of the hive mind find latchpoints in men who have implants interfacing directly with neural nodes, catastrophe is quick. Augmented sensory pathways become radios the hive mind can tune. One by one, men with augmetics begin to speak with the same clipped cadence. Feed. It is a low, faithful repetition, and those who hear it feel, for an instant, the simplest of urges. To comply, to help, to open a bulkhead, to hand over their ration cards and their children. Crew tries to put distance between himself and a man whose eyes have gone soft as melted glass, and is told in his friend's voice to let him in. The choice is not offered. The compulsion squeezes like a hand. At some point, Whether because of the hive mind's psychic volleying or because of the biological spread of spores, the ship's own fabric seems to answer. Bulkhead's breath. Plating knits and then splits with a living appetite. The hydraulic seems open, and something cold and wet slips from between the plates like the tongue of a submerged thing tasting the air. Men realize in a single, gut-stopping second that the boundary between inside and outside has become negotiable. That is the catastrophe. The architecture they have trusted begins to present exits in the wrong places, doors opening into the dark as if to welcome. The desperate counterattacks are a blur of light and ash. Where previously machine and man had an advantage, armor, velocity, order, discipline. The Tyranids have neutralized those through a combination of adaptation and the ship's own compromised systems. Crews jury-rig flamers, but the flame burns the resinous filaments too. And from those burnt filaments come iron dark seeds that curl into the vents and survive the heat. Bolters have their mag feeds gummed by gelatinous residue before the second magazine clicks home. Grenades detonate and shower the corridor with sticky, mutagenic ash that binds to the plating, sprouting quick tendrils that crawl like vines toward components. Men die in ugly ways, impaled on barbs that fold like the petals of some terrible flower, hurled into the void by an automated hatch that opens at the wrong time, consumed in the soft silence of a vent where their mouths make a small, surprised "oh," and then nothing. There are moments of heroism that do not look like the epics of old. Mara, hands slick with another man's blood, rips her hypo glove open and clamps a saline line into a pump and forces it into an infected child's arm. She sings in a voice small and hoarse a maintenance lullaby, not a prayer exactly, but a string of calibration notes learned by rote. The child opens her eyes and blinks, and for a moment there is recognition there, and Mara believes stupidly and defiantly that the child will be spared. It is not to be. The moment is broken when the child's pupils constrict, and the small mouth curls into a wordless sound that is not a scream. And then the child's back arches, and something under her skin ruptures, and a black bloom unfurls that latches to Mara's forearm like a kiss. Mara swings where she can, but the bloom clings, and in the strain her own skin splits with the sound of cheap cloth tearing. Crew by this time is a man in ruins, moving through corridors with the speed of someone who has accepted they will die and chosen to die doing something. He organizes a rear guard to hold a corridor and give others time. They make a stand in the rec room, in a place lined with the relics of other worlds that suddenly seem too sentimental to be meaningful. They seal the doors, they fire, they die in rostered order. The rec room becomes a mausoleum of small brave acts, each one documented by a dying man's hand on a maintenance slate. Crew survives because at some point he bargains with a hard luck kind of fate. He throws a satchel of incendiary charges into a vent and takes a blinded step back and prays the closure will be enough. It is not. The vent chokes and then answers, and the satchel explodes in a way that opens a new corridor to the deck above, hissing like a mouth. The moments when the machine god seems to falter are the most terrible. The tech priests, in their desperation, perform rites that feel like profanations. They open panels and pour sacred oils and recite code as liturgy, and shove their own sensory implants into sockets, and hope the ship recognizes them as priests rather than patients. Varrock sacrificially inserts his own ocular feed into a compromised mainframe in an attempt to see the hive mind's pattern directly. For a flash, his vision is terrible and magnificent, a web of taste and memory, of names and dead planets and the impression the hive has left on the bones of worlds. He sees 1,000 mouths learning to fit into a hinge. He sees, finally, the hive mind, not as a shape but as a process, a pressure, a grammar of appetite, a decision function with no mercy. It understands him, not as a man, but as a resource. It appraises the structure of his worship and selects the points that will allow the greatest harvest. Varrock rips his ocular feed out in panic. The augur priest, who had been trying prayers, now clutches his head and weeps. which is a thing priests do rarely and only in the face of a logic they cannot reconcile. For all the tech lore of their lives, Varrock and his brethren had believed there were machine errors and human errors and only those. This is neither. This is a predator that uses both machines and men as tools, that repurposes code and flesh with elegant brutality. As the ship's last good corridors narrow and the survivors are compressed into pockets of light and human noise, an escape is serendipitous and also sorrowful. A launch bay is compromised, but one pod is functional. Crew carries a child to it, a small, shaking bundle whose breath is a rabbit's. Mara stumbles behind him, skin raw, chest bleeding where something had struck her, and Varrock follows, hands stained with the oily blood of circuit boards and the ichor of bodies. The augur priest is not among them. He stayed to chant something that nobody will find useful later. They launch into the black with what is left of their humanity taxed and raw. The pod separates with a small, mechanical cough and begins to trace a trajectory away from the hull. The survivors inside are quiet as graves. The child whimpers and turns her face into Crew's shoulder, and the texture of her hair is absurdly normal and stupidly, heartbreakingly real. Varrock closes his eyes, listening to the distant Hive chorus shrink as they put space between themselves and the ship. But horror in this story does not end neatly. Aboard the pod, Crew thinks them safe. Varrock tries to think of repair strategies and the mechanical calculus of survival. Mara tries to count respirations to keep herself from falling into shock. None of them notice at first the tiniest sigil of movement beneath the panel where the child has tucked her feet, a hairline seam in the polymer the size of a confidence. It opens like a pupil. A glint of something that is not quite bone and not quite polymer peeks through. The augur priest's words, if he had said any that mattered during the launch, would have been something like this. The Hive reads the lines of flight as it reads the lines of a carcass. It appraises escape and learns. A single-minute filament slips into the pod. It is ridiculous in its smallness and absurd in its patience. It finds the child's tiny sneaker and presses a point that will, in time, do what the others did. Seed, tune, and make a throat speak the Hive's small syllables. Crew senses nothing but warmth in the child's body and the normal marital simplicity of being alive enough to be saved. Mara lulls and hums, and the pod's engines stutter toward an empty spindle of a star and a future that is uncertain but possible. The pod sensor returns a small blip on a sideband frequency. The second it records the blip, a vibration runs through the hull like a finger drawn in a secret code. The augur priest's last incantations, unrecorded, unknown, are answers to a question their systems did not yet understand. The Hive Mind learns the pod's signature in the space between breaths. The final tableau of the climax is not a cinematic explosion. It is a slow, dawning realization. On the pod's wall, a small fuzz of filaments arranges itself into a pattern like a letter, and the child, sleeping, smiles. The soundtrack fades into the drone of the engines, and then, beneath that, the distant chorus restates a pattern. A harmony the augur priest had once tried to name. They are not safe. Not yet. The ship, mutilated and screaming in sections, continues to sing a broken hymn while the Hive listens and learns. The last rivet of certainty falls away. Between the shock and the shape of what will become the aftermath, time stretches and compresses. Men die and men survive on the margins. The Hive has shown its face, and in doing so has become something more terrifying. It has become familiar. It knows the skin of the ship now, the mapping of 100 instruments, the lullabies the crew used to sleep by. It knows the names the children whisper in the night. It collects names like beads and feeds on them quietly. As the climax resolves into tragic mechanics, what remains is grief and the faintest ember of something older. Stubborn human stubbornness. The survivors stare into the dark and remember faces and voices, and in that remembrance they discover something that the Hive cannot easily render, an insistence that their own story not be entirely erased. They sing, as the pod carries them away, not to ward but to hold. A sequence of trivial human things recipes, a half-remembered nursery rhyme, the name of a street, song as talisman. It is not a weapon, it is a refusal. When the chapter closes, the ship is a ruin that is not yet counted. The Hive has tasted its first banquet and learned the architecture of a ship's heart. The survivors are few, and those few are changed. They carry in them shards of what the Hive learned. They carry questions that will not close. The scene is not clean. There are no final triumphs. There is only fallout, bodies, and the slow marking of survivors who must carry the memory of what became of their brothers and sisters. And then, at the very edge of silence, one last sound. A faint tapping. Not loud, not urgent. Just a tapping, like nails on a rusted plate. It could be nothing. It could be the pod's hull settling. Or it could be a small intelligence testing a door. It could be the Hive's strange patience. And in that tapping lies the truth of what will come next. That knowledge multiplies appetite. The tapping goes on as the pod drifts, and the black around it is enormous and indifferent. Hold that tapping with you. Let it be the hinge into the final chapter, where the dread will not be a spectacle but a companion, patient, hungry, and unrelenting. When the last siren faded, and the pod's distant engines died into a narrow hush, the world did not become quieter so much as rearranged itself. Silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is a different kind of noise that holds like a subtle pressure behind the ears. The survivors learned that in small, private ways. They learned it when Mara stared down at the smear of polymer that had clung to her palm, and found in its sheen the same patient geometry she had seen in a child's pupil. When Varrock, with a hand that no longer surprised him by its steadiness, found a fragment of braided filament between his fingers and could not tell whether it belonged to machine or to bone. When Crew pressed the child's small, warm hand to his cheek and tasted, in the salt and breath of it, the idea of innocence as an ache. The pod carried them, and with movement came time, that folding, elastic thing that lets grief turn to ritual and ritual into memory. They took turns keeping watch so their minds would not unspool into the thin, fractal panic that gathered around moments without structure. They spoke in low voices that tried to name what they had seen and failed to find words that fit. Language had become inadequate in the face of what had consumed their ship. To describe the Hive was to fall into metaphors that never quite matched the thing. It was simpler and somehow more terrible to keep lists. What had been lost, what had been salvaged, who had died with a prayer on their lips. Lists are a way humans hold chaos at arm's length. Varrock made a list in the half-light of the pod. Instruments that had failed, codes that had been corrupted, the places where filaments had fused with connectors. He wrote with the care of a man cataloging relics. In the margins, he left small notes to himself, pragmatic and futile. Seal ocular port, avoid direct feed. Do not allow implants to connect without filtration. The notes read like a map made by someone who had seen the map fail. They were necessary, but they did not soothe. He found in the steadiness of writing a ritual to keep the edges of his mind intact. Crew taught the child to count breaths. The counting was both practical, keeping panic from swallowing them, and sacramental. Counting is a way of measuring presence. It anchors the self to the body. When the child reached every 10th breath, she would giggle, a small, absurd sound that made Mara laugh despite everything she had tasted in the wards. These tiny remembrances became talismans, a shared joke, a name, the scent of a pressed cloth. They are small gifts people give one another when the world has been stripped to essentials. But beneath these human economies of coping there remained the knowledge that the Hive had learned. That knowledge lived like a second shadow pressed against each of them. The augur priest's last murmurs, fragments, unrecorded, had been delivered into the ship's guts, as if he were scattering seeds in a garden he expected to fail. He left behind small wards and sigils, scraps of code woven into him that had been designed not to command the machine but to confuse it. They had bought time, not victory. The Hive knows how to wait. Time for the Hive is a syllabus. It learns the shape of things by patience and repetition. The pod carried its small filament. The filament found a seam. The seam birthed a bead that fit, in the child's sneaker, into an unnoticed valley between polymer and cloth. It is too obvious, and therefore trivial, to call such a thing fate. Fate suggests meaning. This was method. A million tiny choices made by an intelligence that did not need to be cruel to be effective. It needed only the ordinary: a match left alight, a latch unbolted, a man who sleeps without suspicion. Slowly and without spectacle, those ordinary vectors rearranged themselves into a map the Hive could follow. The survivors felt their minds brush that map in tiny waves. Crew found his hands wanting to rest on a panel they should lock. Varrock sympathized briefly with the idea of letting the pod drift, of not attempting any rescue or answer, a thought that felt like weakness and like salvation at the same time. Mara began to dream of hands that were not hers, trimming the edges of bandages with a surprising delicacy. Dreams are where the Hive rehearses. The boundary between dream and waking is the seam the Hive uses most often. They tried to secure themselves. They tried to find a star to fall toward where nobody could follow. They scanned the pod for contaminants and found bead-like filaments so small that under the instruments they appeared almost as dust motes. They could be wiped away for now. They could be sterilized from the obvious places. But sterilization is a surface remedy, and the Hive is not a surface thing. It is a grammar in motion, a lesson written across skin and circuitry wherever it touches. The survivors made a decision that carried with it the last consolations of agency. They would not be known as those who had fled. They would be witnesses. They would catalog, they would tell. They would not let the tale be swallowed into silence. They made that vow in the small gestures of naming. Varrock insisted they keep their given names. Crew scrawled, in shaky script, the simple logs of horror he had watched unspooled. Mara insisted on the dignity of burial, as if a body wrapped in cloth might retain more of itself than a body left to a maw. For a while that vow held them afloat like driftwood. Voices over long-range bands, poor, crackling things, answered with static and then with other stories. Planets burned, fleets diverted. The galaxy had tasted the Tyranid before in fragments and ruin, and here the survivors were not the only witnesses. Theirs would be an addendum, a small punctuation in a longer chronicle of attrition. They began to send data bursts, all they could salvage to reach other ears. The transmissions were truisms, coordinates, sensor logs, the names of the lost, but they carried a tone no protocol could smooth, a tired, patient insistence that knowledge be shared before appetite turned it into silence. The world outside reacted in ways that had their own cruel rhythm. Fleets that could have struck hard stayed cautious. The Tyranid is not a foe one simply confronts and eliminates with straightforward tactics. It coils and rebuffs, and in many cases the only answer is attrition. Commandments were rewritten in dispatch rooms as new doctrines were printed. Quarantine zones extended, orbital bombardment protocols modified to avoid simply creating new nutrient beds for the Hive. In maps, the ship's name became a blot, a flagged coordinate that made commanders narrow their eyes. The survivors watched these bureaucratic processes with a mixture of relief and disgust. Relief that action might be taken, disgust that reaction moves like bureaucratic molasses. Inside their skins, the survivors changed. They were no longer the same people who had walked through the ship's calm corridors at the beginning. Loss leaves patterns that are not always visible at first. Muscle memory shifted by trauma, an involuntary flinch at certain cadences, food that now tasted like iron. Their faces held a new economy, less color, more lines etched like soft warps. Varrock no longer found solace in naming servoskulls. Crew's rosary had a bead missing and he could not remember where he had lost it. Mara would sometimes stop mid-task and stare at the point where a child had last smiled. As if expecting to see, it rearranged there again. Most dangerous of all was the knowledge, like an ember, that one or more of them might carry the Hive in a way that could be activated later. They made tests, they cut samples, They burned things and watched the smoke for odd scents. They quarantined and re-quarantined. But certainty is a luxury and none of them had it. The pod was not a laboratory and the instruments at hand were instruments for life support more than for final answers. So they did what witnesses do. They told stories. Stories become a defense. In telling them, the survivors wrote themselves into the outside world. They described, in blunt, measured phrases, the slow logic of the Tyranid approach, how it used patience, how it learned, how it turned shelter into conduit. They told of the resin that fused connectors and the filaments that braided into vent actuators. They told of small filigree of change, how music that had once been lullaby had become vector. Listeners who received these accounts felt the cold trickle of scrutiny in their spines. Some officers issued orders. Some whispered prayers. Some turned away and pretended not to have heard. Weeks passed in the pod that could have been measured in a lesser way. Heartbeat counts, breath counts, the slow depletion of rations. They watched the stars with an angle of grief like a hand held to a window pane. At night the child would sometimes cry and then, in a voice half-dreamed, would say a new sound, a soft clicking they had not taught her. It was tiny and half-formed and could have meant anything. They listened to it and felt their mouths dry. Naming that sound would be to begin the process of turning it into a problem that could be solved. Not naming it was to leave it as a phantom inside them. On a day which had not been marked as anything special, they sighted a cruiser, not a fleet, just a single responder that altered course to meet their own vector. Help, at least, had not entirely abandoned them. The meeting was careful and full of protocols. The responders took samples and cauterized and tested, and then took the survivors aboard a quarantine rig that smelled of bleach and formality. There were more tests, more scorch marks under lenses, more cautious faces. The responders listened to the survivors' accounts and filed them as both data and testimony. They treated the logs with the formality of officers and the pity of people who have seen similar blots before. And yet the small, patient facts persisted. The Hive learned. The survivors' notes contained too many things that suggested an intelligence that could adjust to code and to prayer. It could not be crushed by a single answer. It would be countered with methods and arsenals and sacrifices. But the thing that made the story ache was not purely its physical horror. It was the idea that appetite can learn the shape of sanctuary and return, with a patience that would make the ancients themselves feel inadequate. In the end, there was no neat closure. The quarantine rig took the names and declared dispositions. Some were returned to duty, others to medical wards, and a few to quiet rooms where perhaps the mind would stitch its own piece. Crew returned to a regiment that would never be the same. Varrock petitioned for a posting where code could be rewritten, and where he could teach machines to mistrust certain rhythms. Mara, whose hands had saved and failed and saved again, asked only for a small garden patch aboard a colony liner where she could grow lentils and watch a green thing live without being turned into food. The child, for a while, became a small, fragile anchor. She would hum sometimes, a rhythm not wholly learned nor wholly new, and Varrock would sit near her and stare at the pattern, trying to map her breathing to his counters. He would not tell the latter, larger truth aloud, that what the child learned would be something that neither scripture nor software could entirely prevent. He kept that knowledge like a coin in his mouth, mildly metallic and quiet. If there is a final human thing to say about stories like this, it is that memory is the small defiance against appetite. The survivors carried with them the names, the recipes, the nursery rhymes, the stupid jokes, the face of Mara's mother, Crew's feather, the way Varrock's hand would click against a caul. They repeated them at odd hours like talismans, an oral liturgy designed not to fix the past or to undo the future, but to insist that a life was more than an input-output function. The Hive, patient as weather, recalibrated its maps and moved on. It did not vanish. It dispersed into other reaches of space, mutating, learning, and leaving behind places that would take generations to grow back. Planets were quarantined, fleets burned, Bodies were buried in patterns of dignity and sorrow. The galaxy adjusted as galaxies do, at bureaucratic pace and with quiet acts of mercy. In the last scene, in a corridor that had once hummed with confidence and now with memory, a small servo skull rolled past a discarded relic and paused. Its light flickered in a sequence that Varrock had once taught it, an old habit of affection. For a moment the skull seemed almost ludicrously benign, a tiny fossil of safer days. Then, if one listened closely, under the soft mechanical whir, there was the same patient tapping that had haunted the pod's hull, a distant, steady sound as of someone learning to trace the edge of a rim. Hold that tapping with you for a while. It is neither promise nor threat alone, it is a fact. Appetite learns, memory persists. Humans make lists, sing songs, and tuck small objects into pockets so they can find them again. The last line of this chapter is not a conclusion so much as a comma that continues the sentence of the world. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they are waiting.